So two ways of thinking about China's rise that sort of, if you were in a graduate seminar in international politics, people would talk about. So I have these sort of cute terms that we use in town sometimes, so forgive me because I'm normally a hater of cute terms. But the two basic schools of thought are, on the one hand, panda huggers, and on the other hand, dragon slayers. That's the articulation that I use. And some of you who've been following this issue for a long time may recall, I think it was in 2005, then I guess he was Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick was in Chengdu and physically hugged a panda cub, which caused a great amount of commotion here in Washington about whether this was an articulation of his view of China, that he was putting himself squarely in the panda hugger camp. So what is a panda hugger, after all? In general, people think about China, panda huggers think about China in two different ways. And the first sort of way is liberal institutionalists. And so what these people think is that international institutions like the United Nations, but also different sorts of trade institutions, multilateral regional groupings, etc., pose important constraints on the way that states behave in the international system. So the crucial challenge for liberal institutionalists is the question how to incorporate China into a series of international institutions, international legal obligations, and international norms that will head off any sorts of bad behavior that we seek to avert in the future. The second variant of panda huggers, and in general these tend to overlap, people may take both of these views at the same time. This turns on a variation of democratic peace theory, right? And so what these panda huggers believe is a sort of interlocking set of mechanisms that will lead to a lack of security competition between the United States and China. So the first sort of link in this causal chain turns very much on trade. So it's less about international institutions and more about the trade relationship. And the trade relationship produces economic growth, which I think everybody agrees on in China. And that economic growth produces a growing middle class in China. So people move from sort of subsistence agriculture and move into what could be loosely coined a middle class. Growing middle classes, the theory goes, tend to demand greater political rights, political reforms, and even voice in choosing their own government. And those demands over time produce democracy, or perhaps not democracy, but a more democratic, more liberal regime. That more democratic, more liberal regime, as the theory goes, then plugs into a crude version of democratic peace theory. I should say in defense of democratic peace theorists, this is again a quite dumbed down variation of their theory. But the idea goes that as China becomes more democratic and more liberal, there will be some pleasant harmony between American security demands and Chinese security demands. This isn't very well articulated, whether China sort of makes its peace with American military domination of the Asia-Pacific region, or whether there comes to be some condominium of powers, or what precisely happens. But this produces, again, a general harmony, comity, and peace, averting security competition in the future. Then lumbering up ominously come the dragon slayers. And these people in academic terms have a very, very sort of parsimonious theory. And the story is basically that if China's economic growth continues, U.S. China relations are headed for big trouble. And it doesn't take into account democracy. It doesn't take into account, or I shouldn't say it doesn't take into account, it doesn't ascribe much predictive power to democracy or to international institutions or even to the profound economic relationship. If China becomes more powerful in this view, it's going to try to achieve regional hegemony in Asia, the same as any other country situated as China would be situated would do. And it would do so for sound strategic reasons, not because it's wicked, not because it's imperial, not because it's sort of a reemergence of a sort of Hitler-esque state, but rather because that's the best way for China to produce security for itself. At the same time, for sound strategic reasons, the United States would try to prevent that from happening. It would ring China with an array of hostile alliances. It would conceivably cut off or circumscribe economic relations with China in an effort to strangle Chinese economic growth. This is a grim, tragic view of international politics, but it's one that's out there. So you have these two very starkly drawn schools of thought in sort of political theory terms in the academy. But how does that matter in Washington? Am I just prattling on here about what some tweedy academics are talking about? No. U.S. China policy combines these two views in important ways. So very rarely do you find a card-carrying dragon slayer or panda hugger in Washington. Everyone is some amalgam of the two different theories. So by and large, and Dan's done a good job of explaining the exceptions to this rule, pretty much everyone in town favors the economic relationship in some form or the other. We want to label them a currency manipulator, or we want to impose duties on Chinese products, or we want to do a number of different things to sort of tweak the balance of payments, et cetera, et cetera. But you rarely hear people coming forward and saying we need to end the economic relationship with China in an effort to strangle it so that it can't pursue more military power and domination of Asia. So there is broad, general support for economic engagement with China in Washington. Similarly, there is broad, general support for what I think has to be termed a policy of military containment of China. Recently, as part of the pivot, Leon Panetta announced that the United States would be changing from deploying 50% of U.S. naval assets to the Asia-Pacific region, upping the ante to 60% of U.S. naval assets to the Asia-Pacific region. And Panetta was asked in June of last year, well, what's the story here with this pivot? Aren't you guys just really containing China? There have been a number of questions along these lines, and the responses always go as they did last June in general. Panetta says this is not about the containment of China. Why is the United States deploying 60% of its naval assets to the Asia-Pacific region? Because of the challenge of humanitarian assistance and needs, the challenge of dealing with weapons of mass destruction that are proliferating throughout the world, and dealing with narco-trafficking, and dealing with piracy, and dealing with issues that relate to trade, and how do we improve trade, and how do we improve lines of communication, end quote. The Chinese, unsurprisingly, do not believe this story. They do not believe this story because it does not deserve to be believed. Ask yourselves if the Chinese leadership was devoting 60% of the People's Liberation Army Navy assets to the Caribbean Sea and the seas around the west coast of South America, and remarked that it was to deal with cocaine trafficking, marijuana trafficking, and had nothing to do with the United States, nor did it have anything to do with its growing alliances with Venezuela and Cuba. Ask yourselves if your bosses would give that argument so much as a moment's consideration. It is a risible idea, and I think the reason we tell this fictitious story is more about American clients and partners in the region than it is about deluding ourselves that we can convince China that this story has any merit. So if we don't have dragon slayers, we don't have panda huggers, what do we have? Well, foreign policy people are always fond of making up ridiculous terms, and today will be no exception to the rule. Interestingly, there was a paper, Zalmay Khalilzad, before he became a diplomat working in Iraq and in Afghanistan in the last 10 years, was a scholar at the Rand Corporation. And he, with a team of other scholars, wrote an article titled Congage China. Right? So what is congage? It's containment and engagement. That's what we need to do. We need to contain China militarily, and we need to engage China economically. And as I argue in the paper, that for all intents and purposes has been America's security policy, or America's foreign policy, really, toward China for decades now. So bringing this sort of congagement school, this hybrid view of China, into the context of U.S. China policy and into the context of the pivot to Asia, what are my sort of criticisms of these ideas lead you to believe about this policy? The first is that there's an essential contradiction at the core of congaging China, containing China and engaging China. And that's simply that the one aspect of the policy makes the other aspect of the policy more difficult. So you will hear people in towns say that this is just a hedging strategy, right? We're investing in China, we have a lot of interest in Chinese economic growth, but just in case things don't go as our causal mechanism, you know, the middle class, the democracy, the peace and reconciliation, binding up China in international institutions such that they can't act out too dramatically, we're going to put a lot of military effort into ringing in China and circumscribing its ability to act out militarily in Asia. Except it's not a hedging strategy, because the more you engage China, the harder it becomes to contain China, and I think Dan would be the first to tell you, the more you contain China, the harder it becomes to engage China. One aspect of the policy works entirely at cross purposes with the other, which is not what hedging means. So that's the first problem with the pivot. This sort of deep embedded contradiction in the very premise of the policy. The second big fundamental problem with the policy is that America, for decades, has looked upon the infantilization of its allies and partners in Asia as a feature rather than a bug. There's an interesting article that I cite in the paper and that I commend to you if you have interest in this question, by a scholar now at Georgetown University, but previously who served working on Asia in the administration of George Bush the Younger, named Victor Cha. It appeared in International Security, I believe, in 2010. And as he explained, the so-called hub and spokes system of alliances that the United States assembled in Asia in the middle of the 20th century was designed with what he terms a power play rationale. That is that the United States set up a number of bilateral alliances with countries that were much weaker than the United States and put the United States on the hook to provide for their security in an effort to control those allies. U.S. policymakers feared that a Japan or a South Korea would act out rashly and in ways that endangered the United States. So we viewed diminishing their defenses at the cost of building up our control over their foreign and security policies as a trade-off worth making. I argue in the paper that whatever sense that rationale made in the middle of the 20th century, it makes very little sense today. The United States should be encouraging multilateral cooperation in Asia, not just with the United States at the center of the action, as is our wont. If India, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries wish to engage in military partnerships, in cooperation, even in arms trading, the United States should be encouraging that, rather than insisting on playing a central role and paying a remarkably disproportionate percentage of the cost of defending those states from threats real and potential. So those are the two big critiques that show up in the paper. Engagement is contradictory, and the United States should stop infantilizing its allies and demand that they do more to defend themselves. So what to do now? Well, they're sort of entailed in the contradictions. The first thing is to do less ourselves and demand that Asian states do more. If you look at the threat environments facing the United States, facing Japan, facing India, facing the Philippines, facing Vietnam, and look at the percentages of GDP that the various countries devote to defense spending, you would absolutely have a hard time making sense of a country like the United States that faces a much more benign threat environment, spending much more as a percentage of GDP than countries that are looking at a growing power that is making a series of ambitious territorial claims, and engaging in provocative diplomacy to say that they're sort of lackadaisical about their own security. It doesn't make much sense on paper, and if the United States stepped back, other countries would step up and do more to ensure their own security. And that leads to a general point that the United States should look at Asia as an opportunity to revert to an offshore balancing strategy. If in fact, China looks like the return of Nazi Germany, starts gobbling up its neighbors, enslaving their peoples, that would be of profound concern to the United States. But we don't want to build that assumption into the core of our policy as though it's metaphysically bound to happen. The United States should watch out for that anywhere. If Brazil has some flight of fancy in South America, that's important to the United States. If, as some people have projected, a sort of European collapse happens, and Germany, God forbid, starts throwing its weight around in Europe, that would be of concern to the United States. And by the same token, if China were to behave in this way, that would be of concern to the United States. But we have no reason to believe that that's a foregone conclusion. And acting as if it is makes it more likely that the United States will engage in a very costly security competition with China, and at the same time make that outcome even more likely. So I think I'll leave it there and take questions. Thank you very much.